Thank you again to our conference supporters, Blue Shield of California Foundation, Cal OES, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And with that, I am going to pass the mic over to Megan. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy today.
Thank you, Jasmine. And hello, everyone. My name is Megan Tanahashi. I am one of the communications coordinators here at the partnership. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm coming to you today from Nisenan land. As Jasmine said, today's theme will be moving from trauma to healing. And healing is an essential part of our work, not just for the folks we work with, but also for ourselves. And I'd like to share one of my favorite quotes when it comes to self-care and healing from Audre Lorde. She says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So with that reminder to seek out a little radical self-love and healing for yourself, I'd like to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Amanda Gibson, LCSW. Amanda Gibson is a licensed clinical social worker and an independent professional counselor with 15 years of experience. She treats adults and families in the areas of child welfare, domestic violence, trauma, chronic health, and mental health and wellness. She is the founder and CEO of Counseling Collab in Sacramento, California. Counseling Collab provides a collaborative space where therapists of all different backgrounds can come together and serve the Sacramento area. While earning her master's in social work at UCSC, Amanda served as the program director at Good Shepherd Shelter in Los Angeles from 2003 to 2006. In January of 2014, she returned to serve as at the shelter as the director of clinical programs and operations after working in Sacramento in mental health. Amanda is an adjunct associate professor at USC School of Social Work who teaches online classes to MSW students on the topic of IPV and DV and global violence against women. So welcome, Amanda.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you today remotely. I can remember being together in 2019 in Los Angeles for the conference, and I'm looking forward to being in person with you next year. I'm just going to put that out there that we'll be able to be together. So I've been asked today to talk about healing from trauma. So I've named the talk, The Healing Never Ends, because that's one thing I've realized in my own life, in my work with survivors, is that the healing is always accessible. We may just have to adjust what we're doing and find deeper levels of healing. So we're going to talk about collective trauma and healing today. And for this sort of journey I'm going to take you on today, I wanted to share a little bit of my personal experience going through the last 2 years through the pandemic and the meaning that I have made out of going through this. And then talking about from a community lens standpoint, what is collective trauma? How do we understand what we're all continuing to go through? And then looking through a systemic lens at racism and white supremacy culture. And the second half of the talk will talk about how do we heal? What are some healing-centered approaches, looking at things like decolonization. And I'll be sharing with you my new book project coming out next year called Goddess Tending. Okay, so taking you back down memory lane for myself, I started working as an assistant program director at Good Shepherd Shelter in 2001, right after I graduated from undergrad. And I had been a volunteer there throughout college. I worked the evening shift. Those of you who've worked in direct service with survivors and families in a shelter setting, so a transitional shelter. So I got to go in the afternoon, run the afternoon programs for the kids and the moms, and then do the night duty, as we called it, where I would go around and check on the families. And I really loved my job, and I liked my schedule at the time because I could watch the Today Show and drink coffee and maybe take a walk or do some yoga so that I could take care of myself before going into work. But in reflecting on this experience of going through the collective trauma of the pandemic, I reflected on the last time I felt this scared, which was sitting in my living room drinking coffee, as I always did, on 9/11, fresh out of college, first job, and feeling like the world had really changed forever. I also lived right by LAX airport, so I was very aware of the sounds and the smells and the sight of airplanes. And on 9/11, everything stopped and it was so quiet. It was so eerie. Another thing that was personally difficult for my family was that my brother's father was in the air flying for American Airlines that morning, and it took us a few hours to find out if he was safe or not. I wanted to stay home that day. I felt like I can't go to work like this. I was so emotional, but I was asked to come in, so I did. And what I thought I would get when I walked in to the administrative offices was big hugs and "we can do this" and emotional support. But what I actually got was this. So I have a very clear memory of my boss at the time taking me aside and telling me, shaking me by the shoulders and saying, "You need to hold it together. You can't cry. You can't be upset. You just have to work today. I need you to be present. I need you to be with the families." And I am a very emotional, sensitive person. I always have been. It's really part of who I am. It's very integrated, I think, at this point into my practice as a therapist, but as a new worker, a new domestic violence advocate, was like, how do I turn this part of myself off? It didn't really feel possible, but I wanted to be in line and help. So I stuffed it all down and I got through the day somehow. Flash forward to March 2020, when the pandemic was hitting. I had my own organization I'm running with a staff of people that were scared and vulnerable and didn't know what to do. And I remembered that moment of my boss shaking me and telling me to hold it together. So I tried to be very aware of holding space for employees and clients to be able to process what was going on. And there were so many unknowns, and we thought it was only going to be a couple weeks, and then it turned into months and things kept changing. And that really was the big part of going through this collective trauma of the pandemic, is that everything had to change really quickly. So we had to convert all of our counseling offices to online offices. We also, and I know this resonates with many of you who stayed working through this whole time, regardless if you were online or not, but as in the social work field, for example, we're kind of warned to not work with a population or a group if it's very personal to our own experiences with trauma. Now, many of us might have gone through a trauma before and we got some therapy or we did some healing, and we want to go help people like ourselves. And that can be very powerful. And that's very much a part of our field, as many of us are survivors of domestic violence or other types of relationship abuse who do this work. But there's some distance from it usually. And as a therapist, we're trained to be a blank slate, to be neutral, to not talk about ourselves, to not show emotion. But how do I go through this trauma and help people while I'm going through it myself? So that was a very unique part of this particular collective trauma, but at the same time, somewhat similar, at least initially, to what we went through after 9/11. I felt a lot of fear, panic, loss, and incompetence. I really thought when the pandemic hit that I was going to lose everything, that I would lose my house, my business. Initially, a lot of people dropped out of therapy because they were afraid of the finances. They weren't sure how long this was going to last. They were running around going and buying supplies for their families. So it felt like it was maybe going to end, that we weren't going to get through this. And I felt very incompetent because, like all of us, none of us have been through a pandemic before. And I'm very used to knowing what to do in most situations as a therapist and as a social worker. And then I found a point of resiliency and purpose. And I felt sort of like an imposter and very isolated through the next few months of the pandemic. The resilience and purpose came from, okay, everybody's feeling this. We can really talk about mental health and trauma in a way that we never have before, because this wasn't just something isolated to certain people who had quote unquote bad things happen to them. Every human was experiencing the collective trauma of the pandemic. So I went on the news and I started talking about cool things like co-regulation, which I'll talk about a little later today, to share information with the wider audience. But I also felt like an imposter at times when, you know, I might have just, before I went on the news, felt really irritable and frustrated after being sheltered in place with my husband and being isolated. I'm also an extrovert and I really thrive off of socializing and seeing friends, and not being able to do that was really hard for me. And then I would describe the next phase that I went through was this idea of resistance, hope, and change, and really embracing that there's no more normal. There was this article that came out in April called Prepare for the Ultimate Gaslighting. We're all relationship trauma experts here in this room. And we know gaslighting, right? We know that people who cause harm, who use power and control techniques and dynamics will often gaslight victims. And this article was about kind of our society gaslighting us, telling us to go back to normal. And it's kind of ironic to think about that in April, we thought that we would be reopening and that we would be through it. And we're still very much in dealing with the pandemic. And I started to question how good was normal anyway? And who are these people that get to say what is normal? So I looked at going back to those very early days in our field, looking at how I overfunctioned in that moment of crisis and trauma at 9/11. We were focused on productivity, meeting our goals, our grant requirements, and just this overall culture of hustling, trying to keep up and working really, really hard. And I feel like I did all three of those things all of my career, but the pandemic did slow down things and gave us all an opportunity to reflect and think about what was normal that good. And I started to look at things like how slowing down had a positive impact on climate change. Those first couple of months when we were all locked down and not going in, we saw a really positive impact by not having so many cars on the roads. The air was clean. Maybe there was more, connecting with each other over virtually, or just saying hi and stopping, talking across the street to a neighbor. And then looking at the difficulties of operating in this capitalistic system that we're in, and the impacts of colonization on our society. So I started to really look at, where does this idea of normal come from? And then the summer of 2020, I can remember watching George Floyd be murdered on television with my husband, and my husband screaming and crying, touching his neck over and over again in a tender, gentle way, and saying that could be my uncle, my cousin, my nephew, or me. I was also very impacted. And when I think about those moments and those days, it was really, really difficult. But I had to turn on my telehealth camera and work with a swollen eyes and heavy chest and process another collective trauma with clients that was very much, this time, even more personal for me and my family. And most clients wanted to process what happened, but I noticed that depending on their proximity and their lived experiences with racism, it ranged. The reactions had a big range. They varied. My white clients were shocked and in disbelief, or some just shut down and not even wanting to acknowledge it. And then my clients who identify as people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, there was a lot of anguish and head shaking and like frustration and anger. Why are people just waking up to this? This has been going on for so long. The only thing that's changed are these cameras. And what about all of the other people who've died at the hands of law enforcement? So it was really challenging to process that and again, contain and hold space for now 2 collective traumas going on at the same time. On my break this particular day, I looked at my phone and I had a missed call from the alarm company, a missed call from my husband, Damien, a missed call from the alarm company again, and a text that said, police was dispatched to my office, and I was at my home office. And I knew within moments that if my husband got called by the alarm company, that he would be going to my office. My heart started to race, my hands started to shake, because I wasn't afraid of the stuff in my office or the furniture or the actual office itself. I was afraid that my husband could be harmed or killed because he was going to be encountering law enforcement. So I fumbled to call him really quickly to make sure he was okay if he'd had the encounter yet. And he said, I'm going to put you on speakerphone and I'm going, because I don't know if they'll believe, the police will believe me that I should be here. I'm in my work clothes and I don't know if they'll believe that I'm authorized to be at your office and that I'm your husband. I had to resist taking control over the conversation because I knew that somehow my whiteness could act as a currency to give my husband's life more value when he was interacting with law enforcement. I could hear that thankfully this particular officer seemed to be reasonable and believed him and said everything's fine here, and we hung up. And after we hung up, I cried. I had to release fear. I began to wonder if my family had any idea of what this feels like. Being married to a man from Black, Indigenous background, I can only have insight into what it's like to be him. I will never fully understand what it's like to be a man who interacts with law enforcement, who has brown skin, who has this background and fear for my life. I'll never know what it's like to be working in my front yard gardening and have a neighbor stop by and ask for my business card because they assume I'm a landscaper and not a homeowner. And nor will I ever understand what it's like to be told my whole life that my life matters less than a white person's. So I began to look a little bit more at my family and myself. And I have this picture here of my family from, I think, 2015. And I sort of jokingly, but seriously have in quotations, nice white people. I had been buffering my family from Damien and Damien from my family the whole time that we've been together. I perpetrated racial harm against my husband by not believing him when he would tell me about the microaggressions, the covert under things that I wouldn't pick up on that he would, that were harmful. I would dismiss him, I would minimize his experience and excuse their behavior. Before he even met my family, I told them about what wonderful people they are, and they are. They are wonderful people. I love them. And they have done a lot of good work in supporting me in my career. For example, they volunteered at the shelter, they donated money, and it's still actually going on. There was some houses that were purchased by a group of family and friends for aftercare families to live in and receive Section 8 housing from the shelter. And I thought that was enough, right? To show the goodness in giving back and volunteering. But when I had to really look at myself and my complacency in what it was like to have a Black Indigenous person of color now in our family, not just a person that we were helping in some way, engaging in white saviorism, et cetera, but that this was a person who I loved that was now in our family. I was right there. I am my family is me. And I thought that I was different and that I wasn't capable of perpetrating racial harm, but I am, and I will continue to learn and grow and work on not doing that. But it's so ingrained in our society and our culture. I decided to ask my brother and sister for help in talking with my parents and my family about this experience that my husband had been having in our family. And I remember talking to my sister, again, this was days after George Floyd's murder, and we were talking about soup to make and things to do with the pandemic and getting through social distancing. And I had been crying, and I was in the middle of drafting an angry email entitled "Slave Table." And this was a moment of really trying to look at the covert and overt racial harm in my family. So there was this beautiful mahogany table that my mom had in her bedroom most of my life growing up. And she described it as a family heirloom. She protected it. She took really good care of the table. Then it was moved out into our living room. And one day when I was in high school, one of my aunts was visiting, and she looked over and said, "Oh, that's the table that the slaves ironed on." I'm not kidding you. I almost felt my stomach drop through the floor. My eyes got really big. But sadly, I stayed quiet because there's so much mythology that was always told around my family's history in this country that I was too scared to question it or ask, why in the heck did we still have this table in our house or a part of our family? Because the reality is, yes, that table is a family heirloom, but it represents that my family enslaved people and stole land from Indigenous people. That is the truth. It's the both and. So I pleaded with my sister and said, what do you think it's like for Damien to go over to the house and see this table? I've told him the story, he knows about it. Can we work together to unpack this and work on changing our family culture? So my siblings did listen and wanted to be a part of helping with this. And everybody read books: How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility, My Grandmother's Hands. We had some initial conversations, and some acknowledgement and apologies happened from certain members of the family, and certain members of the family are, I guess I'll say, still working on it. But we had to call it out and acknowledge it and not continue the mythology, and find the both and that we can still be good, nice white people, but we can perpetrate racial harm. This is my husband's family, our nieces and nephews. I titled this one Auntie from Day One because they really have a culture in their family of being experienced with biculturalism and have a way of being accepting and loving. And the only thing you have to do is be focused on loving one another, and you get that acceptance. And we also have to choose our family. These are some of our friends where we have these intersecting identities of love and belonging and acceptance. And we've had to choose as a bicultural family, what does this mean? And how do we let love in? And how do we give love out? So shifting back to the community trauma, this is what we felt with the pandemic and the summer of 2020, that it was shattering the basic fabric of society. And aside from the horrific loss of life, collective trauma is also a crisis of meaning. We also learned about our bodies and our stress response, and that we really aren't equipped to stay in the stress level that we were in all of last year and into this year, that we usually need to get through that resistance stage to get past the exhaustion. This was another article that we found helpful about surge capacity, that we really were hitting that and continue to hit that. And, you know, we work in this field where we're dealing with a lot of crisis, and this felt different, right? We didn't quite have the capacity to get through this collective trauma. So one of the things that was really helpful for the presentations I gave during the pandemic, and a big part of my clinical practice, is understanding polyvagal theory. So I'm going to go over this with you as a way of learning how our bodies work and how we adapt and adjust to traumatic events. So the ventral vagal system, that's the green nerves that are coming through. That's our social engagement network. The location is on the face, throat, and neck. And this is our ability to socially engage and connect with others. And in order to do that, we have to feel safe. The other part with the red nerves that you see in the picture is the fight or flight mobilization part of our nervous system. This is where when we are facing danger, we want our bodies to work, to get away, to fight, whatever we need to do. And you'll see that showing up as increased heart rate, tense muscles, and fast, shallow breathing. The dorsal vagal is the freeze, collapse, dissociative response. Remember, our bodies are always trying to keep us safe. And when we go into the freeze and mobilization response, it's usually because we feel that we can't get away or we can't fight. So we have to submit in some way to the situation, to the stressor. This is a representation of what happens in our nervous system, is that we build from the bottom up, and we're constantly trying to see, are we safe? Are we loved? And can we actually access our executive functioning? So thinking back for yourself through the pandemic or last summer, what emotional state were you in at given points? It might have been kind of hard to concentrate at work if you were feeling really unsafe or scared. The flight or fight response with symptoms shows up as anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, having chaotic responses, emotional or angry outbursts, impulsivity, panic, feeling unsafe, and having racing thoughts. The hypoarousal, the freeze or avoidance response, looks more like checking out, I can't think, emotional numbness, feeling like you're on autopilot, just going through the motions, separating self from your feelings. This is that really shut down part of our nervous system. So what are we trying to achieve with working with our vagus nerve? One of my favorite authors, Resmaa Menakem, calls the vagus nerve the soul nerve. And we all have it, and we're all ideally each day through each moment trying to find a window of tolerance where we feel connected and calm. And this means that we are feeling our feelings, we're connected to ourselves, we're able to emotionally regulate and self-soothe, and we can go between these nervous system states with relative ease. The parasympathetic response kicks in, which tells our bodies that we're safe, we can rest, digest, and connect. So now we'll move to the systemic lens of racism and white supremacy culture. And then when we get to the healing section, we'll tie all of these things together. What is white supremacy culture? This comes from Tima Okun's work, and I have the link in the references. I highly recommend you check out her work. White supremacy culture is a widespread ideology baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups. Many, if not most of them, are communities, towns, states, nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly what whiteness holds value and whiteness is value. Resmaa Menakem also has said white body supremacy is the standard by which all bodies are measured. The website is whitesupremacyculture.info for you to check out. But I've got the components of white supremacy culture here as identified originally by Tima in her article. And I have it here on a wheel because as I started to look at the systemic part that I think affects both of the collective traumas of the pandemic and racism are these components of white supremacy culture: urgency, fear, perfectionism, things needing to be qualified, either or, binary thinking, progress is better, more is better, worship of the written word, individualism, defensiveness, denial, right to comfort, avoidance of conflict. And I'll go over those, the definitions of each of those. So fear is white supremacy culture's #1 strategy to make us afraid. When we are afraid, we lose touch with our power and become more easily manipulated by the promise of illusionary safety. So the anecdote, or what to do with this idea that the fear that gets instilled in white supremacy culture that we're all living in and dealing with, is that we really need to know that we belong to ourselves and others, and name fear when it arises, and develop skills to move it through our bodies. And that's where the polyvagal theory comes in, is to feel the feelings in your body and let them move through you. The ideal of that there's one right way to do things is connected to the belief that perfect is attainable and desirable for everyone, and connected to the belief that I'm qualified to know what is the perfect right way for myself and others. And that can come into play a lot for us as white leaders of social service organizations and working in this field, thinking that we know what's best for the victims or for staff, instead of looking at them to be the experts in their own lives. How do we combat this? Develop a culture of appreciation, process mistakes as learning opportunities, and embrace a feedback-informed culture. So we want to be able to make mistakes and talk about them without being afraid of getting in trouble, or that means something is wrong with us if we're not perfect all the time. Thinking of things as either or binary, this really reduces the nuance of relationship and complexity in life. And we need to know that it can reinforce the urgency and perfectionist thinking and abuse of power if we think everything is either or, yes, no, right or wrong. So how do we work with this when this comes up either within ourselves or in our teams or organizations? Is when we feel that kind of locking into, no, there's only this or that, yes or no, this way of thinking, is to actually try to look for more than two alternatives and push deeper for analysis, think creatively. And so when that starts to come up, you can take a pause and go through looking at, if we're getting into this either or black and white thinking, we actually brainstorm more creative ways to solve a problem, to be inclusive of other ideas. Denial and defensiveness. This is the habit of denying and defending against the ways in which white supremacy and racism are produced in our individual and collective participation in that production. And when we are facing this one and finding a different way out of it, the anecdote looks like trying to understand the link between to fear in losing privilege, losing face, losing comfort or power. That when this denial or defensiveness comes up in people, that it's really linked to fear. Right to comfort, fear of conflict. This is the internalization that I or we have a right to comfort, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. The anecdote to this is being uncomfortable and knowing that it's the root of growth and learning. I would say that this is one of the things that really showed up in my example with my family. The idea was that we needed to work really hard to make ourselves comfortable and not consider what it would be like for a Black, Indigenous person of color to be joining our family. And there's a lack of tolerance for the discomfort, and a lot of families that are dealing with this, or just within organizations as well. And that we really can learn to tolerate discomfort by using things like the polyvagal theory. Individualism, our cultural story that we make it our own without help while pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, is a toxic denial of our essential interdependence and reality that we are all in this literally together. So how do we integrate an anecdote? The opposite of this is really making teamwork a value of the organization, giving credit to all that are involved, and using meetings to solve problems, not just to meet. Progress is more, quantity over quality. This is the assumption that the goal is always more and bigger, with an emphasis on what we can objectively measure as more valuable than quality of our relationships to all living beings. So how do we find a new way and not have it be so focused on progress and quantity? Is to develop what's called process goals. So evaluating how you're doing along the way of meeting a bigger goal and measuring that progress. And then sometimes stopping and recognizing, creating space that we need to acknowledge people's feelings and concerns, so that we're not just bypassing them by being overly focused on progress. Worship of the written word, honoring only what is written, even then only what is written in a narrow standard, even when what is written is full of misinformation and lies, and erasure of the wide range of ways we communicate with each other and all living beings. So the anecdote to this is looking at how do people receive and share information, find alternative ways to document what's happening, recognize contributions of each individual, and make sure information that is written down is understandable and jargon-free. Urgency, applying the urgency of racial and social justice to our everyday lives in ways that perpetuate power imbalance and disregard for our need to breathe and pause and reflect. I would say we saw a lot of that this summer in a lot of different spaces within families and agencies and organizations, of just tell me how to do this. I want to know the roadmap and I want to get through it quickly, instead of understanding that it really is a lifelong process of unlearning what racism and white supremacy culture does. So what we want to do as an alternative is to set realistic work plans, make sure that leaders understand that things may take longer than expected, and set transparent, realistic goals for diversity, inclusion, and equity. So you all are familiar with this power and control wheel, right? In your 40-hour domestic violence IPV training, you would have gone over this. You probably use it at work every day or are aware of it. And I want to have you take a second and see if you can see any connection between white supremacy culture and the power and control wheel. So we're going to pull up the characteristics of white supremacy culture one more time. And then compare that to the power and control wheel. So the economic abuse can come in with thinking that just because someone doesn't have a degree in something, the person causing harm may use that against them, or not let them work, think that they have more power over the money. And then using threats or coercion, setting up, if you don't let me see the kids, then I will do this or that, right? We're very familiar with people who cause harm using that binary either or, black and white thinking. Fear connected to using intimidation from the power and control wheel, right? Thinking that you could die, being threatened, your life being threatened, your children's life being threatened. And then with defensiveness and denial, that's directly connected to denying, blaming, and minimizing. We know people who cause harm do that very well. And I think I would also add in gaslighting into that. And then with white supremacy culture being so focused on individualism, that can happen when the person causing harm is trying to isolate the victim and them, and thinking that they are all that matters to them, and they're, instead of maybe the extended family and community. Using emotional abuse, oftentimes the person causing harm takes that position of the right to comfort, and making the victim think that they've done something to cause the abuse. Using privilege from the power and control wheel, I think ties in with perfectionism, right? You have to do everything exactly the way that I'm saying it, or it will be an excuse for the violence. Worship of the written word, I think that really connects to how we believe or don't believe victims when they come forward, and how many of the laws and legal system require things to be written down and give that more precedence than what the person's actually saying who's gone through the abuse. And the urgency, I think, applies to all of the above in the power and control wheel. So hopefully that's making sense to you all, and we're onto something here to think about: how is white supremacy culture connected to the work that we're doing in intimate partner violence advocacy? So one thing that I want to point out is that we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma within individuals or families, but I believe this happens within organizations. And a lot of people who are running these organizations, and I was one of them, have what we've called the oppressed oppressor leadership energy, which means maybe as a woman, I've experienced some oppression or sexism. And so then I am going to oppress other people that I am leading, because I'm repeating that cycle of harm, of oppression. And that's something I've definitely realized was going on in my early days in the work in the field with the leaders in the organizations, especially the founders of organizations who've been doing this work for so long. And so one way to look at, as a leader, especially as a white female leader, an invitation to ask you to reflect and look at these questions. In what ways have you experienced oppression? Have you or your work been undervalued? I can remember sitting with groups of leaders and talking about how it would feel when we wouldn't get the funding we needed for domestic violence services in our respective counties, and how awful that would feel. Do you feel like you're always fighting to be heard? So those are examples of what, as women, we may feel as leaders. And how many times have you thought or said, that's the way we've always done it? So within organizations. When I got started in the field, it was whatever, fill in the blank. We will never have enough time, money, or resources to do this work, but who else will do it? And if I'm not here, then fill in the blank, the organization will fail, the work won't continue. So this experience of oppression and intergenerational trauma within organizations, I fear could get passed down like other violence, white supremacy culture can get passed down within individuals and families. So this is really an invitation for those of you who are in leadership to look at, as you're looking at succession planning, the next generation of leaders coming up, are we passing down this urgency, this perfectionism, this way of thinking that really can create unhealthy work environments? So that's my challenge and invitation to those of you that hold those positions. And again, what is the purpose of a domestic violence, intimate partner violence advocate? These are all taglines from some of your websites, some of the organizations I worked with in the Los Angeles area. We're stopping violence, we're ending the cycle, we're preventing, we're advocating, promoting self-healthy relationships, and lifting up survivors. And what do we know how to do in this field? We disrupt cycles of harm. We identify patterns of power and control, and we acknowledge how these dynamics of power and control, as well as forced empowerment, can play out with our clients, what we do organizationally with our clients. Advocate for accountability for those who cause harm. This is what we do. We know how to do this. So when we look at how do we look at healing from the collective trauma of the pandemic, continued healing from systemic racism, my call to action to you is use the wisdom and knowledge of this movement, of what we've already done, to look at the dynamics of violence and harm and trauma and how that gets passed down. Actively engage in anti-racism practice. It is not a class you can take and a certificate. It's ongoing and lifelong. And one thing I've learned from going through my experiences this last year is that it's every moment by moment, day to day, I have a choice to practice anti-racism, and it is not something that I can attain or get to, right? That would be that urgency part of white supremacy culture. Overly commit yourself to racial equity principles, overtly commit yourself. And then look at how can the collective trauma of COVID-19 be integrated and metabolized into your organization? Have you stopped and paused and processed what you all went through? The amazing things that you did in the last year of repurposing your work, continuing to raise money, staying open, and have you had time to have a staff retreat or some gathering as you're maybe coming back more integrated into the office to reconnect and gel again, because we've been so isolated. I think it's so important that we take a pause and really process what has happened. And then again, breaking intergenerational patterns of organizational trauma. Some of you are in positions where you have the opportunity to not continue to pass down maybe the way that you were trained when you first got into this field. Maybe you're one of the very early founders and leaders that was literally paving a way in a movement that was brand new in the late 1970s. And really looking at, with your staff and employees and employee to employee, co-creating a sense of belonging. Really looking at, I don't know the right way to do this just because I might have a title or more power within an organization. I need to look at how I co-create that with my team. Becoming self-aware, this is your individual responsibility, learning how to self-regulate. And for white women specifically, joining a group like White Women Reckoning with Racism. There's many groups out there that you can join, and it really is the work of, when we're looking at unpacking the oppressor leader and model and white supremacy culture, it's really not a good idea to try to do that cross-culturally in understanding how this is coming across and how it's coming through your body and your leadership and how you're communicating with people, to really look at unpacking that with other white women and looking at how much maybe we've continued to perpetuate racial harm, even if we are nice, good people. When we're still operating in that white supremacy culture, we have continued the harm. And if you don't have one readily accessible, this I just threw out here, and I will be accountable and join with you if needed, but why not start one through the partnership? Why not start one for deviant intimate partner violence advocates to have a place to reckon with racism? Okay, how do we heal? I'd like to talk about an approach that many of you may be familiar with, creating healing-centered engagement. It centers culture, people's culture. It asks what's right with you, and it focuses on interdependence. Sounds familiar with the anecdotes to white supremacy culture. So there are some frameworks that exist for doing this. It also helps to build awareness and encourages people to take civic action who've been victimized. And it also works a lot on restoring identity and meaning and purpose and importance of each individual person's identity, but also acknowledges the intersectionality of different identities and with one another, and really focuses on bringing a sense of belonging, which I think is a huge thing we need to do within our organizations. There's also a course that you can take that I have a link here called Healing Centered Engagement. Many of you are familiar with trauma-informed care. I know last year I gave a workshop for the conference on culturally responsive trauma-informed care. And I think at the time I was really hunting for looking at what's missing from trauma-informed care. I still think it's a great approach, but it can really focus more on individual experience and looking at symptoms of trauma and the pathology and more of like the illness part of having a post-traumatic stress disorder rather than on wellness. And healing-centered approaches really does incorporate cultural responsiveness and looks at the collective experience. So we talked a lot today about collective trauma, the trauma of the pandemic and racism, and that we really look at what is the root cause of the trauma. It's usually tied to a systemic problem like white supremacy culture, and healing-centered approaches name that and say, hey, wait a second, it's not my fault that I'm feeling this way or operating in this way. I've been living in this system. How can we change the system? But first, how do we name what is systemic versus interpersonal versus community? Or maybe it's a combination of all three. And the healing-centered approach also really focuses on well-being more than pathology. So another idea for looking at how you can uncover your own intergenerational healing and resiliency. So we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma being passed down, but how do we know that healing and resiliency doesn't also get passed down? One thing that can really help to look at your own intergenerational ancestral roots is to explore the concept of decolonizing yourself. So going in and looking at what were my ancestors going through different periods of time, going way, way back, all the way back to what was it like for me personally, would be looking at the Druids in the landmass of Ireland, and before Christianity, before colonization. That can be a really impactful exploration. And I think for most white people who are living on this landmass, we often only know our history back to the United States, maybe a little bit about what European countries we come from, but we may not look at the fact that our ancestors might have came here to escape things like really terrible oppression and horrible acts of violence happening, and that we don't really talk about, well, if my ancestors were being oppressed and burned at the stake and all of the terrible things that we know about from the Dark Ages, that could be passed down as someone who has the ability to oppress and cause harm. And that's part of the healing that has to happen, is that we have to look at those parts of ourselves. But we can also look at what would happen if we pass down resiliency, hope, and healing. All of these practices of polyvagal theory and mindfulness are rooted in ancient practices and rituals. So we're talking about, you know, this stuff that's written down now that are trainings and interventions that therapists can take. But if we really look back to our ancestors, they were doing all of these things to self-regulate, like singing, dancing, humming, drumming. All of these things are not new. Our ancestors were always doing this. And really, when we're returning to our natural state, it connects us with all other human beings and the soul nerve. That's the polyvagal theory. Another idea is to think about renaming your title and purpose. So if, for my research that I did decolonizing this past year, if the words that would be used in a pre-Christian, pre-colonized society would be, a therapist would be considered a healer or a shaman, a teacher, a sage, a CEO, a guide. A succession plan would now be talking about, how do you transition to being an elder? Not that your job's getting taken away, but how can you be an elder that's in a respected, esteemed position? And when you're hiring someone new, they're starting their journey to becoming an elder. We need to do these practices with honor and recognition and be careful to not appropriate from cultures that are not ours, and really look at naming that. So this is what I did looking at my Irish ancestry. And then taking these well-established principles from trauma-informed care and looking at it a little differently, instead of just saying, well, you're just supposed to make people feel safe and help them find a solution. Really what we're doing when we're interacting with other coworkers, employees, or clients, that you are self-aware and you're practicing self-regulation so that there's a sense of belonging and that you're co-creating a solution with whoever you're with, that there's no one right way to do anything. So combining the awareness of our ancestral roots, looking at polyvagal theory, and then a little bit more into the cognitive behavioral realm, the next part is to look at understanding how hope works actually in our brains. So many of you are familiar with learned helplessness, which came from a study many, many years ago. I think in the 1960s, they've now come out and said it's actually not, wasn't an ethical study, and that we've learned a lot about brain science. That's actually not a real true experience that's going on. I also think it can be really stigmatizing and pathologizing if we look at our clients and we label them as being helpless. So looking at what is the science of hope, what they learned when they re-looked at that learned helplessness study, and they looked at what we know from neuroscience today with brain imaging, that passivity in response to shock is not learned. It's a default unlearned response to prolonged adversive events, which in turn inhibits escape. So it's not that survivors, victims are passive if they're maybe not ready to leave, maybe they don't want to leave. We have to have space for all of that in our field. But really, when we're working with people and thinking, well, what's going on here? It's that prolonged adverse events that is creating that freeze response or the fawning response of immobilization and shutting down, because it feels so overwhelming and scary to stay safe any other way. So I want to also say that hopefulness does not discount the negative. We can have hope and be hopeful while still living through negative experiences. The evidence is convincing that hope buffers stress and adversity, predicts important outcomes, and can be learned and sustained. A warning about hope, though, is that it can be weaponized. It can be used to bypass reality. It can be turned into gaslighting people. So we need to use the hope with a culture responsive lens, acknowledge lived experience and systemic oppression, because we can't just tell people just have hope. We have to talk about that the nervous system regulation mixed with a learned hopefulness is really a way of healing. So how do we activate the hope circuit? If you have hope, is really having expectations of a better future mixed with nervous system regulation. So it's both and. It's the cognitive strategies mixed with the body-based strategies. So this is a framework for self-care and community care that I have added to, that comes from Dina Zant from her article, The Complexity of Self-Care. So I really want to, I know we're almost at the end of the talk, but really focus in on this because this is really huge. Because I know how people in our field either don't take care of themselves, or if they do, sometimes they might confuse self-soothing with self-care. So none of this, again, we're not doing black and white either or thinking. It's both and. So self-soothing are activities that distract from comfort during difficult times. This is okay to do as long as you know you're doing it and you're setting the intention. So if you need to binge watch your favorite Netflix show, take a bubble bath, exercise, snuggle a pet, we need self-soothing sometimes. And the way that self-care, sorry, I skipped ahead, self-regulation are these practices that are employed when we are in a separated part of our nervous system. We're not in our window of tolerance. We're hyper aroused in flight or fight. Things you can do for self-regulation are breathing, mindfulness walk, grounding techniques, playing. Play is a part of your nervous system where you're mobilized and connected. We all need that, even as adults. You can get up and move towards the door if you're starting to feel trapped or panicky. Journaling and using fidgets or poppets or putty to just exercise out that anxious energy that might be coming up when you're hyper aroused. When you're hypo aroused, when you're in the freeze, collapse, or submitting part of your nervous system, again, breathing's at the top of both of these, but moving your body, dancing, rocking, tapping your facial bones or collarbone, pushing your toes into your shoes, pressing your tongue on the back of your teeth, staying in your body, having a mantra like I am safe, I am enough, I am whole, whatever resonates with you, and then holding a grounding object like a rock, crystal, or keychain. So self-care, what we need: self-soothing, self-regulation, but self-care are the actual activities that you are using to find meaning and support your well-being and being grounded and seeking interpersonal growth. So these are different activities in self-soothing or self-regulation. That's going to therapy, resting, eating healthy foods, using a mindfulness practice, taking ownership of your finances, setting and keeping boundaries, saying yes and no in honor of yourself. So that's actual self-care, the practices, the activities that you're doing. And then when we look again, we're tying it all together from all of these lenses we've looked at today. Community care, those are the workarounds for systems that don't inherently support self-care. So that looks like things like having dignified, supportive healthcare organizations, childcare collectives, community gardens, skill sharing, mutual aid, worker-owned co-ops, and intimate friendships where you regularly check in and you actually say how you're doing. Structural care is working at that more systemic level, like things like paid family leave, caregiver resources, gender and sexuality liberation, racial justice and equality, living wages, trauma-informed workplaces, and environmental defense and renewal. So when we connect all of this together, we see that we can't do this on our own. It's all the stuff we're doing individually mixed with our community care as well. And I would like you all to know that I am writing a book to pull all this together. And if you want more information about updates about the book project, which is what I'm calling the Goddess Tending Framework, please sign up to get updates from my website. Thank you very much for your time and attention. So I think we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Sorry, my cat was being a terror. We have a question about a link from Miss Bernina, hi, about the Healing Center, and if that could be shared.
Okay, the Healing Centered Approaches certification. Okay, that is on my slides. Do you want me to cut and paste it into the chat, or is that something?
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Okay, great.
Do we have any other audience questions? Those are the only ones I see so far. have one here from Joanne, and it says, are the anecdotes included in the white supremacy culture website that you shared?
Yes, they are. And what's so cool about that website and Tina's work is that she wrote this article after working and doing anti-racism work, and she acknowledges all of the people that she's worked with and how she came up, just like she describes it as almost something moving through her to put this on paper. And then people have taken the framework and applied it in a multitude of ways. And the website was updated this last year because last year people started to look a little bit more at white supremacy culture when people were starting to read some of the books that I referenced and looking at anti-racism practices. So on the website, it's very extensive, and you can click around and look at the different parts of white supremacy culture, read the anecdotes, and then there's a ton of exercises that you can do with your organization or yourself to sort of unpack and weave that in. And, I think even it could be applied to so many things on so many levels too, even within a family context, right? Like, this hadn't occurred to me until I started doing this presentation, but how cool would it be for my family to sit down and look at this and say, okay, what are we going to do for anecdotes so that our legacy as a family is different than secret keeping and mythology and not acknowledging the legacy of slavery, Native American genocide, and land theft.
Thank you. So we have another question here from Lupe, and it says, your family struggled struggles to navigate through a different mindset. What did you find to be the most difficult to overcome?
Ooh, it's been really, really hard. I think the most difficult thing, it's a great question, has been denial and defensiveness, because for myself and my family, we really see ourselves as being nice and kind people. So trying to grapple and understand that we're all swimming in the waters of racism. And we've all been socialized. Even these categories of race are socially constructed. It's like telling someone that the sky is green when they've thought that it was blue all along. And the defensiveness and the denial that comes up in white bodies is really this fear, and this comes from Rosa Menicum's work, My Grandmother's Hands, that's in my references, excellent book, talks about the constriction that happens and this fear of losing or getting things taken. And really, when you look at, if we don't acknowledge or we pretend like the racism's not happening or it doesn't affect us or we don't perpetrate it, then we don't have to be accountable to changing it. Also, when we talk about being empathetic, really, if a white person sits there and tries to empathize, you're going to get lots of shame waves coming up, lots of guilt. And a lot of people will say, like, we don't want white people to feel ashamed, that was what your ancestors did. You didn't actually own people. We don't want you to feel guilty for this. But feeling shame and guilt is different than being shamed or guilted. And I really think that we have to build stamina and sit with those uncomfortable feelings to really, truly be empathetic and make changes.
Definitely. We have a question in the chat from Nick Laughlin. Do you think that hierarchy in leadership in DV nonprofits and organizations promotes white supremacy culture? Do you think that more horizontal leadership might be another way to combat it? And it's not the only answer, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's a great reflection and insight. And I would say yes. When just by the formulation of a nonprofit with a board of directors and the organizational chart, that's based in a system and laws and policies that those things have to be in place to have that 501c3 status. And 501c3 status is really just a tax construct. You have right now, we're living in the both and. We still live in this system that requires these things to be in place, but do you have to practice your org chart like you're actually at the top of a pyramid as a CEO? Or can you look at at making that more horizontal in your leadership practices, looking at white supremacy culture, developing anecdotes that work for your organization. And then it's like, I'm not the CEO, I'm a guide, and I'm co-creating what we're doing here with an inclusive, diverse, equitable approach where the voice of the receptionist is just as important as the CEO.
Thank you. We have another question from Lupe. It's a follow-up. They say that you mentioned R. D'Angelo's book, and did you find it helpful?
Yes, White Fragility, I think I highly recommend reading that for all bodies of culture, because it really does name what like white supremacy culture does, what's happening in the thought process and why it's so hard for white people to talk about race. She came out with a new book, which fits right along with my slide of calling my family the nice white people. Her new book is called Nice Racism: How White Progressives Perpetrate Racial Harm. It's also very good. It's a follow-up to White Fragility. There's some good podcasts that just came out a couple months ago. Want to encourage you to look at your locally owned Black, Indigenous, person of color bookstore to buy those books. They always have Robin's work at those bookstores.
Yes, I love those bookshops. We have a question here. Oh, it looks like it's from our executive director, Elise. How do we dismantle patriarchy while identifying any good tools in hierarchy?
How do we dismantle patriarchy? Can you say that again?
Sure. How do we dismantle patriarchy while identifying any good tools in hierarchy?
That's a great question. I think we need to have a follow-up discussion on that. That I need some time to think about that. But you know, in the white supremacy culture article, Tima does in her new version, where she's updated some information, does really talk about how the white land-owning males most, represent or created the society that we're living in, right? Our founding fathers. And that's really what is at the core of upholding some of the systems that are there. So I think that an anecdote to hierarchy is a more collectivistic, interdependent way of being within organizations. And my hope is that as we're in this both and, where we have to manage that maybe there needs to be an org chart and hierarchy, that we're actually engaging and practicing in a way where we're naming what parts are patriarchal, especially in organizations that might be heavily cisgendered, female, transgender, all the way that we look at femininity that we're unpacking, also in being more inclusive of gender nonconforming, trans community, all that. But what are the ideals of leadership? And maybe it goes back to decolonizing and looking at what societies maybe had more of those, what we traditionally classify as more collectivistic, interdependent leadership styles that may be more from like matriarchal type of societies.
Thank you. Our next question is from Cynthia. What is your advice to help people understand that POC may feel insulted by this topic or concepts you mentioned as a guide, feel pandered to, or just hear tone-deaf public relations catchphrases? Because systemically, there is no palpable change.
Very good question. I know in the Dismantling White Supremacy Culture website, there's a lot of good resources on how to talk about this, because it can be extremely frustrating to sit and hear the platitudes or see the lack of change and change that needs to be happening quickly. And I think, on the website, I really encourage you to check it out. It really speaks to the internalization of the ideals that we're all experiencing participating in the society and the system that we're in. And that internalization can feel very uncomfortable and frustrating, especially for people of color. And I think that the work groups that spin out of doing this work is to also really encourage, people in white bodies to not rely on people of color, to educate them, comfort them. We really need to be doing this work on ourselves and with ourselves, and not continue to perpetuate some of these situations that come up when we try to do it without this lens to look through. I hope I answered that question. Please let me know if I need to say more.
We'll look out for another chat from Cynthia, but in the meantime, we have another question from Lucia. Your comparison of white supremacy and power and the power and control wheel is very powerful in its application to people, domestic violence, and organizations. What are your thoughts, ideas about raising this to systems change?
I'm glad you saw that connection. I got kind of excited as I was making it, and was also trying to graphically represent some of the systemic change. And given this being an hour talk, it was a little short to do that. But I think that our movement, our field, with the partnership could really bring together a group of people to look at this and utilize the materials from the Dismantling White Supremacy Culture website, and look at developing a guide that's really specific to IPV, DV organizations. Because like I said, our movement, our field has created tools like the equality wheel, right? The healthy relationship wheel. Why couldn't we make one of those for our organizations, and making sure that we're using this lens? So I think there's a lot of work that we could do as a movement, as a group, in trying to connect this, and also really be pointing to the systemic change that's needed. So then when we're, going for funding or working with the state legislature, that we say, you know what, we're really going to do things different. We're not going to continue to jump through these hoops and do these things. This is the way that we're operating, and that we're changing our organization. And we'd like you maybe to not, have this really tight turnaround on our the grant application that is creating a sense of urgency and perfectionism and all of those things that end up happening because of that higher level systemic change. So I know other organizations and groups are working through dismantling white supremacy culture. I'm working on a project at a community college in Southern California with their executive leadership team. So yeah, that's Ask the Partnership. Give us a space to do this, and we can build this out, because I think of any movement or organizations, we could actually show how this could work, that we can create a system in our organizations that is an antidote to white supremacy culture.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. I think we're at time, but we have one more question from Lupe. And they say, you spoke about the colonizers and looking back. When our ancestors are the perpetrators, how do we embrace who we are and avoid our combat? How do we embrace who we are and avoid combat or guilt?
I say keep going back in your history to find what were your ancestors doing before they were colonized or Christianized, to get back to those roots and uncover the really ancient history that's there, to keep going back. I think that's where this idea with my book of the goddess tending framework, that resonated with me, to think about like, what's really my inner truth and my authentic self, that it's really this way of being and the sense of being that is really outside of the system of having to be adhere to these feminine ideals or patriarchy or fill in the blank of all the ways that I've been socialized. So I say we have to keep going back to our really true natural selves before all of these oppression, colonization happened. But I think when the guilt and the shame does come up, when you realize that your family owned people or killed people or whatever it is, that you feel those feelings and you process them with your community or in therapy. That's really the true way to heal.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. And it looks like I misspoke. So we are still going till 10:45. So please keep those questions coming. And again, feel free to take that survey. In the meantime, it looks like we have a question from earlier. What are some ways to prevent trauma?
Great question. So, I think that in our lifetime, we all will experience some traumatic event being human, whether that's a car accident or, dealing with early adverse childhood experiences, for example. But the way you prevent the pathologizing part and even getting to the point of having a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is to be believed when you talk about your trauma. That is incredibly important. And we know that from our movement with survivors, especially with sexual assault, for example, that you have community support to heal. You have access to the right healing modalities, because we can all experience trauma, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily have the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And even when we do, using things like polyvagal theory and attention to nervous system regulation and learned hopefulness, we are constantly healing. So we're looking at more of that wellness framework where it doesn't have to be so much about what's missing or this feeling of what's wrong with me as an individual person who's experienced trauma. But I don't think it's realistic to say that we can necessarily prevent all trauma. It is part of being human to go through this. And like I said, our nervous systems and our bodies are always trying to protect us, even when we might have a fight, flight, or freeze response, and we didn't want that to necessarily happen. Or maybe like in my example of not speaking up in my family, I was freezing and shutting down because I was really afraid of what the consequences would be to speaking up. So even when you freeze, you have to acknowledge that that's your body's way of protecting yourself. And you can learn to stay in your body and stay engaged and stay connected and use your voice when something's happening and call it out.
Thanks, Amanda. So we have a question here from an anonymous attendee. It says, what is your stance on land acknowledgements? Historically oppressed people have expressed feeling traumatized by these statements. I realize the intent is not malicious, but it's hard to help those I work with who feel enraged hearing this from individuals who are acting like quote unquote colonizers by placing this energy on the theft of land at the top of daily agenda work.
Wow. That is, I have to admit that's something I hadn't thought about or heard about being experienced, but I think it makes a lot of sense that it could be really disruptive. And also, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, anonymous person, that acknowledgement without accountability can cause more harm. So if we're just saying we're acknowledging this land, some people may say, okay, well, that's a first step. But if you're not acknowledging the harm or the continued legacy of theft, land theft and colonization, then it is sort of like, kind of like well, here, look at this again, and we're going to try to just maybe placate or make people feel better that we're taking this very small baby step. But if there isn't that accountability to follow, yes, someone just said it can be very performative. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. And so I think we have to look at that, if that is the experience, to not just have the acknowledgement, but then actually say, well, this is what we're doing about it. This is our plan. Maybe going a little bit deeper into the language of healing, that we're looking at ways of healing as a culture, as a society, that we're not just saying and checking boxes. And I think that's the real risk, and the really challenging time that we're having right now with people starting to take baby steps, is that it can fall into that tenet of urgency, where we think, okay, we have to do this, check the box, but we're not really looking at what is our whole plan of action to really take this into account, and not just be performing in a way, and not acknowledging what that's like for people to hear the land acknowledgements without the actual follow through.
So this person responds that that's exactly their point. They are supposed to dive into the agenda every day after being told that I guess the folks in the room with them are on their ancestors' land with no accountability. And then follows up saying, why do you often hear land acknowledgement and not land return? Also, have you engaged with Indigenous folks to see if the use of titles of Indigenous roles is not a form of misappropriation? And then, with all due respect, it's not a challenging time for us. It has always been challenging.
Thank you. Thank you for calling that out. I acknowledge those words being limiting and not being completely inclusive of your experience or the experience of others. I think that's saying land return is the next level of what needs to be happening. And so the baby stepping and the small acknowledgements aren't adding up to speaking at that level of where we're really talking about changing things and returning things. That is, I think, something that needs to be looked at, because and then asking organizations who are doing it, if they're not saying return to the land, then asking, why is that the case? And I think we have to really look at that as organizations and leaders. And then I think there was another part about appropriating titles, and I hope in my talk that I was able to recognize that I was speaking about me going back to my ancestral roots in Ireland and looking at those terms, but being very mindful and careful that I'm not even trying not to appropriate that as someone living on this landmass, and not appropriating any other culture's way of being, but truly, I guess the point is trying to get people to go back and look at their own ancestors, going back as far as you need to go to return to your humanity, and not be so focused on the letters behind our names.
Thank you for your your openness and honesty there, Amanda. We have a question here that is thanking you so much for sharing parts of your personal story, for the abundance of great information, especially around collective trauma. Would you say that white supremacy culture ideology can be internalized by those who are Black and Indigenous people of color, especially as more Black Indigenous people of color take on more positions? It says positions of color, but I think it's positions of leadership.
That's a great question. And that's why the resources on TIMA's, the website there's a lot of information about that specifically, because yes, that does happen. And I am noticing in some of the work I'm doing with individual clients in therapy or in organizations, that some organizations or people are embracing actually having the right people around the table. I was recently working with a group that was very diverse and put into executive leadership positions. And we had, a retreat, and we got vulnerable and deep about all of this. And there was a lot of tears and anger and frustration, because it's like, okay, great, we're here. But the system that we're working in is based in this white supremacy culture. So how can we truly be embraced in what we're bringing to the table with all of our intersecting identities, having to do this within the system? And we're in the very beginning of that work with this particular group, but the acknowledgement that started around, first of all, the collective trauma of the pandemic and having to lead their organization through it, and that they had been very disconnected because they had been working remotely, and then just being able to name the system that they're working in and saying, we didn't create this. How can we create something new? How can we manage change in a way where we're looking at how can we have the antidote to this and a new way of leading and running this organization that is starting to dismantle or divorce ourselves from it. I think that it was very, very painful work to look at, and there was a lot of acknowledgement around the internalized oppression, internalized racism of being leaders in those within this organization in particular. So I think that that's kind of one of the first steps to look at, and then really looking at the co-creation of a new way of being and doing things.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Yes, I think it's great to start talking about these ideas, and definitely we're not there yet, right? But there's so much that we have yet to accomplish. So I'm getting the 2-minute warning. I wanted to send out a reminder that go ahead, and if you haven't already done so, take that survey. It's in the chat somewhere. And then a reminder for the optional wellness spaces that are following this. And I think with that, we're at 1 minute. I don't think we can dive into any more questions. So thank you so much, Amanda, and everyone else for joining us. And please go ahead and hop on over to those mindful rooms. Otherwise, take your lunch, and we'll see you back for the workshops.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your conference.